So now we're going to learn about the font property. And the font property is a shorthand property for other properties. So we're going to see what that means in just 1 second. But just as a reminder, we're talking about properties here. And so we have the separation of concerns. We have HTML. We have CSS. HTML is for our structure. CSS is for our formatting. And then in our CSS, we have rule sets. And rule sets are made up of what? What are they made up of? Pause the video, say it. What's a rule set made up of? So a rule set is made up of a selector or selectors. And we've learned all about selectors and compound selectors and whether or not there's a space between an element and an ID or no space between an element and an ID and what that means, right? And we've learned about CSS specificity and the importance of order. So all of this stuff is really important when it comes to CSS and selectors and how CSS is applied. So we have our rule set. It has a selector. Then it has a declaration block. I don't know why I keep laughing. And then the declaration block has declarations. And the declarations are made up of properties and values. So now we're talking about the font property. So just pause the video for a second and re-say all that in your own head. Pause the video, re-say all that in your own head, or write it down on a piece of paper. Because in my experience, like 16 years, 17 years, like almost 20 years teaching at the college and university level, in my experience, it takes students a while just to nail that, to have the right terminology, to think about it in the right way. So we're talking about a CSS property right here, okay? The font property. So if you haven't paused the video, pause the video, okay? And say that to yourself. All right, now let's go on. So the font property, and where we're going to learn about the font properties, we're going to go to MDN font. So I already have that open. And up at the top, this is a place you go for documentation. It says it's a shorthand property. Well, what's a shorthand property? So we could use the font property and we could put values into that, right? We could set the font property to certain values. And those values are going to be, this is a shorthand technique for setting a bunch of other individual properties. So alternatively, instead of making the font, instead of using the font property, we could use the font style, the font variant, the font weight property, the font size property, the line height property, and the font family property. So we could use each of those individually, or we could just use the font property and use settings from each of these and stick them into the font property, and the font property will be like, oh, okay, I know what's going on. So when you first start out, it is always best not to use the shorthand property. Use each of the individual properties, understand them, explore them, look at them in MDN documentation, right? Font style lets you select italic or oblique faces. So understand each of the individual ones first, and then use the shorthand property. The next thing you should always do when you're looking at documentation on MDN is go to examples. So I'm going to click on examples. This is like the second thing I do. So when I come here, I read this, and then I go to examples. And so down here are examples of the font property being used. And notice here's the shorthand technique. And so the shorthand technique has font 12 pix / 14 pix sans serif. Well, what the heck does that mean? So I've highlighted what that means right here. Font size is being set to 12 pix. And remember, this is a CSS property. And line height is being set to 14 pix. But here we did it with the shorthand notation. As you're learning, just set font size 12 pix, right? Like set that property value as a declaration. Line height 14 pix. Set that property to that value as a declaration. Here's another example of the shorthand property, font 80% sans serif, right? So 80%, the font size is 80% of the parent element. Here's another one, bold, italic, large, serif. So font weight is bold, that's a property. Font style is italic, that's a property. Font size is large, that's a property. And then the font is family is being set to serif right there. So let me just set that font family to serif. Wah, wah, wah. There we go. Font family is being set to serif. Cool. So that's how the font thing works. It's made up of the font shorthand property. It's made up of 6 other CSS properties because it's a shorthand property. It's made up of font style, font variant, font weight, font size, line height, and font family. And check out this cool example that they have right here. So I'm going to hold down Control plus on my keyboard, hold down Control and press plus. And I just made that all bigger. And you can play with these right here. So here's some sample text, right? So what happens if I make the size bigger? Cool, the size is bigger. What happens if I make the line height 1.2 or 3, right? It kind of moves it around vertically. What happens if I make it bold? Cool, there's bold. Serif versus sans serif, right? So I'm going to talk about that in a second. Or small caps, serif, sans serif, small caps, or oblique or italic. Oblique and italic, they look like they're cousins. Look pretty normal. So you could see here, right, like how you could, use these 6 properties to change text. So what's the difference between serif and sans serif? So if we really get close on this text, so I'm just going to really zoom in here, and then we set serif versus sans serif, you can see that serif has these little feet. The serif has these little feet. You see those little feet? Like that M has a foot. The P has a little foot. The T has a little foot. Sans serif, nothing. Straight line, peg leg, no foot. Peg leg. And so that's the difference between serif and sans serif. So generally speaking, on the web, people like sans serif. That's what people use. And there's like a bunch of articles out there that will say, hey, sans serif is what you should use on the web. It's the most readable. And generally speaking, yeah, that's what people use. So if you want to stick with what people use sans serif. But if you wanted to sort of, break and do something a little bit different with design, you could use serif. So it does. There are studies that say sans serif is more readable on the web. I've linked a couple of articles here. So here under font property in our course document, I've outlined the font property, and it's made up of font family, font size, font weight, font variant, line height, and font style. And then in green, mostly, there's one place where I put it in pink. In green, these are the different settings it could take. So over on that little page where we were experimenting, right, like right here where we were experimenting, that only has some of the settings, some of the values you could set. And so here I've highlighted the different values you could set for each of these individual properties. And then in pink, I've highlighted, hey, I want to talk about this in this video. So here are the articles on serif versus sans serif. So those are just 2 articles that I liked, so you could check them out and see what the difference is. But again, generally speaking, on the web, people are going to use sans serif, no feet. And how do you remember serif is feet and sans serif is no feet? Well, serif is like, I don't know what the heck that means. Serif define, it's like a squirrely design, a slight projection finishing off a stroke of a letter. That's what it means. So sans in French means without. Like I'm pretty sure that's what sans means in French. Translate, and I'm going to enter sans, and I want it to English. Yeah, so French, without. And so it's saying without that little curlicue. That's what sans means. So sans is without, and serif is with the serif. So anyhow, check out those articles. And then just generally speaking, font size, you have different font size values you could set. They could be different length measurements. We're going to go over those when we get to looking and exploring font size by itself in depth. But you should know that a browser has a default font size. It's usually 16 pixels. You could change that in your browser settings. You could change your browser's default font size. So that's something you should know. You should also know font weight has settings of bold, lighter, bolder, normal. But basically font weight bold. Or you could set these numbers, 100, 200, 300. So 400 is the same as normal, and 700 is the same as bold. So you can set numbers in between, but the font has to support it. When we learn about Google Fonts, we'll see how we choose the different fonts for different numbers, and that way we'll be able to set the different numbers. And font variant lets you do the small caps. So we saw that, which is pretty cool. Font variant, small caps, right? You could kind of see how that changes the style there, the way it looks. But text transform is like font variant's twin brother or twin sister. So, font variant does small caps, but text transform does uppercase, lowercase, and capitalize. So that's another property, another CSS property in and of itself. It is not part of the font shorthand property, right? But I can't help but to mention text transform in the same breath in which I mentioned font variant because they're right next door to each other. Finally, we have line height, so setting the line height. And when we talk about line height, you should know that there's these two words in publishing and print and whatever, web, and leading and kerning. And so leading is the space between lines. Kerning is the space between letters. Okay, so that's just like, hey, when people talk about leading, they're talking about the space between lines. When they talk about kerning, they're talking about the space between letters. I don't know, like the analogies that come to mind for me, leading and line, right? So lead is kind of heavy, flat, long, I don't know. Leading and line both start with L. And then kerning in letters, kerning is like pop kernels or something, and each letter is a little kernel, and I want to space them out. Maybe that'll help you remember it. All right, so that's an introduction to the font shorthand property. You'll see out there when you look at CSS, just font and different settings, right? But know that you could go to MDN and you could see, okay, what is the font shorthand property made up of? It's made up of these 6 other properties, right? And when you're starting, you should just use those 6 properties individually. And then once you become comfortable and familiar with them, start to use the font shorthand property. And then you can just set the settings for each of those individually. So a lot of this web programming is just becoming familiar with the different dials and tools, so to speak. I'm using an analogy here. The different tools we have at our disposal. And under CSS, when we do our formatting, a large majority of that is just becoming familiar with the different properties and values we could set. So we're learning about formatting text, and a huge part of that is the font property and the 6 different font property things we can use to format our text. In the next videos, we're going to go over them individually.